The schoolhouse door slammed shut behind Violet Vance with such force that the autumn wind seemed to echo her frustration. And she stood there on the dusty steps of the one-room building, fighting back tears as the last of the parents walked away shaking their heads in disgust. It was October 1876, and Roswell, New Mexico was a town that had barely carved itself out of the unforgiving desert landscape. The settlement sat along the Pecos River, a place where cattlemen and ranchers had begun to stake their claims, building rough wooden structures that would hopefully withstand the harsh elements. Violet had arrived 3 months earlier with high hopes and a teaching certificate from Boston, convinced she could make a difference in this frontier town. She had been 22 years old, fresh-faced and idealistic, ready to educate the children of the West with all the knowledge she had acquired back east. But from the very first day, nothing had gone as planned. The parents of Roswell had taken one look at her modern teaching methods, her insistence on teaching girls the same subjects as boys, her refusal to use corporal punishment, and her Eastern accent, and decided she was not fit to educate their children. They complained that she filled the children's heads with nonsense about science and literature when they should be learning practical skills. They said she was too young, too inexperienced, too soft. Some of the fathers had been downright cruel, suggesting she should find herself a husband instead of pretending to be a teacher. Today had been the worst yet. She had assigned the students an essay about their dreams for the future, encouraging both boys and girls to write about whatever ambitions they held. When 13-year-old Sarah McKinnon wrote about wanting to become a doctor, her father had stormed into the schoolhouse during the parent meeting that evening, waving the paper like it was evidence of a crime. "You are filling my daughter's head with impossible foolishness," he had shouted, his face red with rage. "Women are not doctors. They are wives and mothers. You are teaching her to be dissatisfied with her proper place in this world." Violet had tried to explain that she was simply encouraging the children to think creatively, to imagine possibilities, but the other parents had joined in the criticism. Mrs. Patterson complained that her son was spending too much time reading books instead of helping with the ranch work. Mr. Cordova insisted that teaching his daughters arithmetic beyond basic sums was a waste of time. By the time the meeting had dissolved, Violet felt like she had been trampled by a herd of cattle. Now she stood alone in the cooling evening air, watching the last wagon disappear down the rutted main street of Roswell. The town was small, consisting of perhaps 30 buildings scattered along both sides of the dirt road. There was a general store, a saloon, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of other establishments necessary for frontier life. Most people lived on ranches or homesteads outside of town, coming in only for supplies or church on Sundays. Violet wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and began the walk to the boarding house where she rented a small room. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she had not felt so utterly defeated. She was seriously considering returning to Boston, admitting failure, and living with the shame of having given up on her dreams. She was so lost in her miserable thoughts that she did not notice the large figure watching her from the shadows beside the general store. Zane Sullivan had been in town picking up supplies when he heard the commotion coming from the schoolhouse. He had been living in the mountains west of Roswell for the past 5 years, trapping and hunting, occasionally bringing furs and game to trade in town. At 28, he had built a life of solitude that suited him well. He was a massive man, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders so broad they seemed to fill doorways. His arms were thick with muscle from years of hard work, his chest deep and powerful. He wore his dark hair longer than was fashionable, letting it brush his shoulders, and his face was covered with several days' worth of beard growth. Most people in Roswell found him intimidating. He spoke little, his voice a deep rumble when he did talk, and his pale blue eyes had a way of looking through people that made them uncomfortable. Children sometimes whispered that he was half bear, and mothers used him as a cautionary tale to keep their youngsters in line. But Zane was not the monster they imagined. He was simply a man who preferred the honest company of mountains and trees to the complicated politics of town life. He had noticed the new schoolteacher when she first arrived in Roswell. It had been hard not to notice her. Violet Vance stood out like a wildflower in a desert landscape. She had rich auburn hair that she wore pinned up in a neat bun, though strands were always escaping to curl around her face. Her eyes were the deep green of pine trees, wide and expressive, showing every emotion she felt. She was petite, barely reaching 5 feet and 3 inches, with a slender build that made her look almost fragile. But there was a determination in the set of her jaw, and the way she carried herself that suggested she was stronger than she appeared. Zane had watched from a distance as she threw herself into her work at the schoolhouse, arriving early each morning and staying late into the evening. He had seen the way some of the townspeople treated her, the dismissive looks and condescending comments, and it had stirred something protective in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Tonight, seeing her standing alone on those steps looking so thoroughly defeated, something inside him made a decision. He stepped out of the shadows and began walking toward the boarding house, his long strides eating up the distance. He would not approach her tonight. She looked like she needed to be alone, but he made a promise to himself. The next time someone disrespected that brave little schoolteacher, he would have something to say about it. The next morning dawned clear and cool, the kind of autumn day that made the desert almost pleasant. Violet dressed carefully in her best teaching dress, a simple gray wool with white collar and cuffs, and pinned her hair up with extra care. She would not give up, not yet. She still had students who wanted to learn, children whose eyes lit up when she read them stories or explained how the stars moved across the sky. Those children deserved a teacher who would fight for them. The school day began normally enough. Violet had 15 students ranging in age from 6 to 14, and most of them were attentive and eager despite their parents' attitudes. She was in the middle of a geography lesson, showing the children where New Mexico territory sat in relation to the rest of the country, when the door burst open. George Patterson, one of the more belligerent fathers in town, stood in the doorway with his 10-year-old son Tommy by the collar. The boy's face was streaked with tears, and there was a red mark on his cheek that made Violet's stomach turn. "My boy came home yesterday talking about how you said the earth goes around the sun," Patterson growled, shoving Tommy forward. "I will not have you filling his head with lies that contradict the good book." Violet kept her voice calm and professional, though her heart was racing. "Mr. Patterson, that is an established scientific fact. It has been proven through observation and mathematics." "It is blasphemy," Patterson spat. "The Bible says the sun stood still for Joshua, which means the sun moves, not the earth. You are teaching my son to question the word of God." The other children sat frozen at their desks, watching with wide eyes. Violet could feel the situation spiraling out of her control. She took a careful step forward, placing herself between Patterson and the rest of the students. "Mr. Patterson, I respect your beliefs, but my job is to teach your son facts about the natural world. Science and faith do not have to be in conflict. Your job is to do what the parents of this town tell you to do," Patterson said, his voice rising. but you are too high and mighty with your Eastern education to listen to simple folk like us. You think you are better than everyone here." "That is not true," Violet protested. "I am simply trying to give these children the best education I can." "You are trying to turn them against their families and their faith," Patterson countered. He turned to address the room, raising his voice so all the students could hear. "This woman is not fit to teach you. She is a liar and a corrupter of youth. Your parents should never have hired someone like her." Violet felt hot tears prickling at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not cry in front of her students, would not give Patterson the satisfaction. "Mr. Patterson, I must ask you to leave," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "If you have concerns about the curriculum, we can discuss them at a proper time, but you cannot disrupt the school day like this." Patterson laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You cannot make me do anything, little girl. You have no authority here. You are just a foolish woman playing at a man's job." "That is enough." The voice came from the doorway, so deep and commanding that everyone in the room jumped. Violet turned to see the mountain man, Zane Sullivan, filling the entire doorframe with his massive presence. She had seen him around town before, of course, but always from a distance. Up close, he was even more imposing than she had imagined. He had to duck his head to enter the schoolhouse, and his shoulders were so broad that he had to turn slightly sideways to fit through the door. He was dressed in buckskin pants and a heavy wool shirt that strained across his muscular chest. His long dark hair was tied back with a leather cord, revealing the strong angles of his face. A thick beard covered his jaw, but it could not hide the firm set of his mouth or the dangerous glint in his pale blue eyes as he looked at Patterson. "Sullivan," Patterson said, trying to sound unconcerned and failing. "This does not concern you." "I am making it my concern," Zane said, his voice low and steady. He moved further into the room, and despite his size, he moved with a fluid grace that reminded Violet of a predator. "You are disrupting these children's education and disrespecting their teacher. That concerns me." Patterson puffed up his chest, trying to appear brave. "The teacher is disrespecting us by filling our children's heads with lies. The parents of this town have a right to determine what their children are taught. You have a right to teach your children whatever you want in your own home," Zane agreed, moving to stand beside Violet. She barely came up to the middle of his chest, and she had to crane her neck to look up at him. "But during school hours, Miss Vance is in charge, and you have no right to come in here shouting and making accusations." "She is teaching them things that go against God's word," Patterson insisted, but his voice had lost some of its bluster. Zane crossed his arms over his massive chest, the movement making his already impressive muscles bulge even more. "I have spent more time alone with God's creation than you ever will, Patterson. I have watched the stars wheel across the sky from mountaintops. I have seen the way the seasons change and the patterns of nature. If God made this world with certain laws, then understanding those laws is not blasphemy. It is appreciating his work." The logic seemed to stun Patterson into momentary silence. Zane took advantage of the pause to continue. "Miss Vance is educated and intelligent, which is exactly what a teacher should be. She is patient with the children and encourages them to think. I have seen more than one of them reading books while waiting for their parents outside the general store, and they looked happy to be doing it. That tells me she is doing her job well." Violet stared up at him in amazement. She had no idea he had been paying such close attention to her work. Patterson's face was turning red again. "Since when do you care about the schoolhouse, Sullivan? You barely come to town except to trade your furs. You have no stake in this." "I have a stake in seeing someone treated fairly," Zane said, his voice dropping even lower, taking on a dangerous edge. And I have a particular problem with watching a man bully a woman half his size. The threat in those words was unmistakable. Patterson was a big man by most standards, but he looked almost small standing in front of Zane's towering frame. He seemed to realize that continuing this confrontation would not end well for him. "This is not over," Patterson muttered, grabbing his son's arm. "The school board will hear about this." "You do that," Zane said calmly. "And while you are talking to them, I will make sure they hear about how you came in here disrupting the school day and verbally attacking their teacher. I am sure they will be very interested in that." Patterson stormed out, dragging Tommy with him. The door slammed behind them, leaving a heavy silence in the schoolroom. Violet realized she had been holding her breath and let it out in a shaky exhale. All the students were still staring, their eyes now fixed on Zane with a mixture of fear and awe. Zane seemed to realize he was still the center of attention and looked uncomfortable. He glanced down at Violet and his expression softened slightly. "Are you all right, Miss Vance?" His voice was gentler now, concerned, and it made something warm bloom in Violet's chest. "Yes, thank you, Mr. Sullivan. I appreciate your intervention, though I am sure I could have handled it." The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile. "I am sure you could have. But sometimes it helps to have someone bigger do the handling." One of the younger children, a 6-year-old girl named Emma, raised her hand tentatively. "Miss Vance, is Mr. Sullivan going to stay? He is very big." That did bring a small smile to Zane's face. "I am just leaving." "You all listen to your teacher now." He nodded to Violet, his eyes meeting hers for a long moment that made her pulse quicken. Then he turned and ducked back out through the doorway. Violet watched him go, feeling strangely bereft. Then she turned back to her students, trying to regain her composure. "Well then," she said, her voice only slightly unsteady, "let us return to our geography lesson, shall we?" But as she pointed out different territories and states on the map, her mind kept drifting back to the mountain man who had defended her. The way he had stood beside her, solid and protective. The way he had spoken about appreciating God's creation, revealing an unexpected depth of thought. The way his eyes had softened when he looked down at her. She shook her head, trying to focus. This was not the time for such thoughts. She had a job to do, students to teach, and apparently a school board meeting to prepare for. But that night, as she lay in her narrow bed at the boarding house, she could not stop thinking about Zane Sullivan. The school board meeting was called for the following Saturday evening at the church. Violet spent the week preparing her defense, gathering examples of her students' work, and making notes about her teaching philosophy. She was determined to show the board that her methods, while unconventional, were producing results. Several of the students had shown remarkable improvement since she started. Little Emma, who had barely been able to recognize her letters in August, was now reading simple books. The older children were tackling subjects like algebra and Latin that had never been offered in Roswell before. Even the students whose parents complained the loudest seemed engaged and excited about learning. But Violet knew that facts and evidence might not matter if the board had already made up their minds. She had heard through the boarding house gossip that Patterson was organizing other parents to demand her dismissal. He claimed to have at least a dozen families ready to pull their children from school unless she was replaced with someone more suitable, which apparently meant someone male and local. Saturday arrived with gray skies that threatened rain, unusual for the desert but not unheard of in autumn. Violet dressed in her most professional outfit, a dark blue dress with minimal adornment, and pinned her hair back severely. She wanted to look serious and competent, not young and frivolous. The church was already filling up when she arrived. The school board consisted of 5 members. Reverend Thomas, who served as chairman, Mr. Cordova, who owned one of the larger ranches, Mrs. Henderson, who ran the general store with her husband, Mr. Blake, the blacksmith and doctor. Morrison, who had recently arrived in town to set up a practice. They sat at a table at the front of the church, looking grave and official. The pews were packed with townspeople, far more than usually attended any official meeting. Violet saw Patterson sitting in the front row with several other parents who had complained about her teaching. Her few supporters, mostly the mothers of her best students, sat on the opposite side of the church. The whole setup felt uncomfortably like a trial. Violet took a seat in the front, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. Reverend Thomas called the meeting to order, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room. "We are here tonight to discuss concerns that have been raised about our schoolteacher, Miss Violet Vance," he began. "Mr. Patterson has brought forward a petition signed by multiple parents requesting that we review her performance and consider finding a replacement. Miss Vance will have the opportunity to defend herself, and then the board will make a decision. Mr. Patterson, would you like to present your concerns?" Patterson stood, looking smug and self-righteous. "Thank you, Reverend. My concerns and those of many other parents are simple. Miss Vance is not teaching our children properly. She wastes time on impractical subjects like science and literature when she should be focusing on basics like reading, writing, and arithmetic. She encourages the girls to have ambitions beyond their natural roles as wives and mothers. She teaches theories that contradict the Bible, and when parents try to address these issues with her, she is dismissive and arrogant." He went on for several more minutes, listing every complaint he could think of. Other parents stood to add their voices, echoing his concerns. Violet felt herself growing smaller with each criticism, each suggestion that she was unfit, inappropriate, too young, too educated, too Eastern, too female. Finally, Reverend Thomas held up his hand for silence. "Miss Vance, would you like to respond to these accusations?" Violet stood on shaking legs, gripping the back of the pew in front of her for support. She had prepared a whole speech, but suddenly all her carefully chosen words seemed inadequate. "I came to Roswell because I wanted to make a difference," she began, her voice soft but growing stronger as she continued. "I wanted to give children opportunities I had, the chance to learn and grow and discover the world beyond their immediate experience. Yes, I teach science and literature. I believe these subjects expand the mind and help children think critically. Yes, I encourage all my students, boys and girls, to dream about their futures. I believe every child deserves to know that they have potential. And yes, I sometimes teach things that might seem to conflict with religious teachings, but I always do so respectfully, and I never discourage the children's faith." She pulled out the folder of student work she had brought. "These are essays and assignments from your children. You can see the progress they have made, the way they are learning to express themselves and think independently. Is that not what we want for them? To grow into adults who can reason and make good decisions?" Mrs. Henderson leaned forward with interest. "May I see those papers?" Violet brought them to the board table, and the 5 members passed them around, reading with varying expressions. Dr. Morrison looked particularly impressed, while Mr. Cordova seemed more skeptical. "These are quite good," Dr. Morrison said. "This essay on the water cycle shows real understanding of scientific concepts." "My point exactly," Patterson interrupted. "She is teaching them science when they should be learning practical skills for ranch life. Understanding where rain comes from seems pretty practical to me." A new voice rumbled from the back of the church. Everyone turned to see Zane Sullivan standing in the doorway. He had cleaned up since Violet saw him last, his hair neatly tied back and his beard trimmed, though he was still an imposing figure in his buckskin and wool. He moved down the aisle with measured steps, his boots loud on the wooden floor. "Mr. Sullivan," Reverend Thomas said, sounding surprised. "I was not aware you planned to attend this meeting." "I did not plan to," Zane admitted, stopping beside Violet. He was so close she could smell the pine and leather scent of him. "But I heard what was happening, and I could not stay away." "You are making a mistake if you let these people drive Miss Vance out of town." "With all due respect, Sullivan, you have no children in the school," Mr. Cordova said. "This is not your concern." "It is my concern when I see an entire town failing to recognize a good thing when they have it," Zane said. His voice was calm but carried an authority that made people listen. "I may not have children in that schoolhouse, but I know the value of education. My mother was a teacher back in Missouri. She taught me to read and write and think, and those skills have served me well, even living alone in the mountains. Miss Vance is doing the same for your children, and you are too stubborn and set in your ways to appreciate it." Patterson jumped to his feet. "Now see here, Sullivan. You cannot come in here and insult the parents of this town." "I am not insulting anyone," Zane said, turning his pale blue gaze on Patterson. "I am telling you the truth. You are intimidated by Miss Vance because she is educated and competent, and that threatens your sense of how things should be. You hide behind religion and tradition, but what you really want is to keep your children ignorant so they never question the way you run things." A murmur ran through the crowd. Several people looked angry, but others seemed thoughtful. Zane continued, addressing the whole room now. "I have been coming to Roswell for 5 years. In that time, I have seen children growing up barely able to read, learning just enough to scrape by. Then Miss Vance arrives, and suddenly those same children are reading books for pleasure. They are excited about learning. I see it every time I come to town. That little Emma girl was trying to read the labels on canned goods in the general store last week, sounding out the words so carefully, and she looked so proud when she got them right. That is because of Miss Vance." He turned back to the board. "You have a teacher who cares about these children, who works long hours for little pay, who puts up with constant criticism and disrespect because she believes in what she is doing. If you run her off, you will end up with someone who just goes through the motions, who does not challenge the children to be better. Is that what you want for Roswell?" Reverend Thomas stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Those are strong words, Mr. Sullivan, but you make valid points." "I would like to add something," Mrs. Henderson spoke up. She was a practical woman in her 50s, respected in the community. "My sister back in St. Louis writes to me about the school her children attend. The teacher there uses many of the same methods Miss Vance does. The children learn science and literature alongside their basics. My sister says it is preparing them well for the changing world. Maybe we should not be so quick to reject new ideas just because they are different from what we are used to." Dr. Morrison nodded agreement. "I studied for years to become a doctor. I learned science that some people might say contradicts the Bible, but that knowledge helps me save lives. I see no harm in children learning how the natural world works." The tide seemed to be turning. Patterson looked furious, but several of the parents who had been supporting him now looked uncertain. One woman near the back spoke up. "My daughter Mary has never enjoyed school before, but now she comes home excited to tell me what she learned. She is reading books I never would have understood at her age. I know some of us have concerns, but maybe we should give Miss Vance more of a chance." Other voices joined in, some still opposed but others now defending Violet. The meeting dissolved into general discussion, with the board members listening carefully to both sides. Finally, Reverend Thomas called for order again. The board needs to discuss this in private. We will take a short recess and then announce our decision." The board members filed into a back room while the crowd waited with anxious energy. Violet sank back onto the pew, her legs too weak to hold her up any longer. She felt emotionally exhausted from defending herself, from hearing all the criticism, from the roller coaster of hope and despair. Zane sat down beside her, the pew creaking under his weight. He did not say anything, just sat there solid and present, and Violet found that comforting. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for speaking up for me. You did not have to do that." "Yes, I did," Zane said, his deep voice rumbling. "What they were doing was not right." "You barely know me," Violet pointed out, turning to look up at him. "Why do you care so much about whether I keep my job?" Zane was quiet for a long moment, his pale blue eyes studying her face. When he finally spoke, his voice was even softer than before. "Because I have watched you since you arrived in Roswell. I have seen how hard you work, how much you care. And I have seen how these people treat you, and it makes me angry. You deserve better." Something in his words, or maybe in the way he was looking at her, made Violet's breath catch. There was an intensity in his gaze that had nothing to do with the school board meeting. "You have been watching me?" she asked, her voice coming out almost as a whisper. A hint of color appeared on Zane's cheeks above his beard. "Not in a strange way. I just noticed you." It is hard not to notice someone who stands out the way you do. Before Violet could ask what he meant by that, the board members returned to their seats. Reverend Thomas cleared his throat and the church fell silent. "The board has reached a decision," he announced. "We have heard the concerns raised by some parents, and we have heard the defense of Miss Vance's teaching methods. After careful consideration, we have decided that Miss Vance will continue as the schoolteacher of Roswell." Relief flooded through Violet so intensely she felt dizzy. She heard Patterson start to protest, but Reverend Thomas held up his hand. "However," he continued, "we ask that Miss Vance be more sensitive to the religious concerns of parents. When teaching subjects that might conflict with biblical teachings, please present them as theories rather than absolute facts, and always make room for faith-based perspectives as well." It was not a perfect victory, but it was victory nonetheless. Violet stood, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you. I promise to do my best to respect the values of this community while still providing the children with a quality education." The meeting adjourned, and people began filing out of the church. Some of the parents who had defended her came up to shake her hand and offer encouragement. Patterson and his supporters left quickly, looking disgruntled. Violet gathered her papers with shaking hands, still processing what had happened. She had kept her job. She could keep teaching. And it was largely thanks to the mountain man who had stood up for her in front of the whole town. She turned to thank him again, but Zane had moved toward the door. She hurried after him, catching up just as he stepped outside into the cool evening air. "Mr. Sullivan, wait." He turned, looking down at her with those intense blue eyes. The church was on a slight hill, and the sun was setting behind the mountains in the distance, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. "I wanted to thank you properly," Violet said. "What you did tonight, what you said, it made all the difference. I do not think I would have kept my position without your support." "You would have," Zane said with quiet confidence. "You are a good teacher and the board would have seen that eventually. I just helped move things along. Still, I am grateful." Violet hesitated, then decided to be brave. "Would you allow me to buy you dinner, as a thank you? I do not have much money, but I could afford a meal at the boarding house." Zane looked surprised, then pleased. "You do not need to do that." "I want to," Violet insisted. "Please. It would make me feel better about everything you have done for me." A slow smile spread across Zane's face, transforming his usually serious expression into something warm and appealing. "All right, then. I would be honored to have dinner with you, Miss Vance." They walked together through the darkening streets of Roswell to the boarding house where Violet lived. Mrs. Cooper, the proprietor, served meals in a small dining room for her residents and occasional guests. She raised an eyebrow when Violet entered with Zane but said nothing, simply set two places at one of the tables. The meal was simple, beef stew with fresh bread, but it tasted wonderful after the stress of the evening. At first, Violet and Zane ate in slightly awkward silence, neither quite sure what to say. But gradually, they began to talk. "You said your mother was a teacher," Violet prompted. "Is that why you value education so highly?" Zane nodded, his expression growing distant with memory. "She taught at a small school in Missouri. My father died when I was young, and she supported us through her teaching. She made sure I got a proper education, even when money was tight. She used to say that knowledge was the one thing no one could take away from you." "She sounds like a wonderful woman," Violet said softly. She was. Zane's voice was thick with old grief. "She died of fever when I was 20. After that, I did not have much keeping me in Missouri. I headed west, ended up in these mountains, and found I preferred the solitude." "Do you never get lonely?" Violet asked. Zane considered the question seriously. "Sometimes. But I find town life exhausting in different ways. All the politics and gossip and people caring too much about things that do not matter. In the mountains, things are simple. You work hard, you survive, you appreciate the beauty around you." "I can understand that," Violet admitted. "Sometimes I miss Boston terribly. I miss my family, my friends, the bookshops and theaters. But I also find it satisfying to be here, to feel like I am building something important." They talked for over an hour, the conversation flowing more easily as they discovered shared interests and values. Zane had read widely despite his isolated lifestyle, trading for books whenever he came to town. Violet was surprised to find he had opinions on Shakespeare and Dickens, could discuss philosophy and history with real insight. "I think people here see you as just a mountain man," Violet said at one point. "They do not realize how intelligent and thoughtful you are." Zane shrugged his massive shoulders. "I do not mind being underestimated. It means people leave me alone most of the time. Until you decide to intervene on behalf of a beleaguered schoolteacher," Violet teased gently. "That was different," Zane said, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "You were different." The intensity in his gaze made Violet's heart race. She found herself noticing details about him she had not paid attention to before. The way his large, calloused hands handled the delicate teacup with surprising care. The deep timbre of his voice that seemed to resonate in her chest. The way his eyes crinkled slightly at the corners when he almost smiled. She realized with a start that she was attracted to this man. Strongly attracted. It was not something she had been looking for or expecting, but there it was, undeniable. From the way Zane was looking at her, his gaze lingering on her face, she thought he might be feeling something similar. But it was getting late, and propriety demanded they part ways. Zane stood, his large frame seeming to fill the small dining room. "I should go. I have a long ride back to my cabin." "You are riding back tonight?" Violet asked, surprised. "It must be miles into the mountains." "About 15 miles, Zane confirmed. "But I know the trail well and my horse is sure-footed. I will be fine." He hesitated, then added, "Will you be all right here? Patterson and some of the others seemed pretty angry when they left." "I will be fine," Violet assured him, though she appreciated his concern. "Mrs. Cooper keeps a tight ship here. No one will bother me." They walked to the front door of the boarding house together. Outside, the night was clear and cool, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. "Thank you again for dinner," Zane said. "And for the conversation, I enjoyed it." "So did I," Violet replied honestly. "Perhaps we could do it again sometime." She was being bold, practically asking him to court her, but the evening had given her courage. Zane's smile was warm and genuine. "I would like that very much. I come to town for supplies about once a month. I could make it more often if I had a reason." "I think you have a reason," Violet said. Feeling her cheeks heat with a blush she was glad the darkness hid. Zane reached out and gently took her hand in his much larger one. His palm was rough with calluses, but his touch was careful, as if he was aware of his own strength and did not want to hurt her. "Good night, Miss Vance." "Good night, Mr. Sullivan, and please call me Violet." "Violet," he repeated, and the way her name sounded in his deep voice made her shiver. "Call me Zane." He released her hand and walked to where his horse was tied, a large gray gelding that looked strong enough to carry his massive rider. Violet watched as he mounted in one smooth motion and turned the horse toward the mountains. He looked back once, raising his hand in farewell, and then he was riding away into the darkness. Violet went upstairs to her small room feeling like the world had shifted somehow. She had come to the boarding house this evening worried about losing her job. She was going to bed with her position secure, and the beginning of something she had not even known she wanted. The next few weeks passed in a pleasant blur. Violet threw herself into her teaching with renewed energy, and most of the parents seemed to accept the board's decision. Patterson continued to glare at her in church on Sundays, but he stopped openly challenging her authority. The children flourished under her guidance. Even the students whose parents had complained about her methods seemed engaged and happy. Violet made a few concessions to the board's request, presenting scientific theories with acknowledgement that some people held different beliefs. But she did not compromise the quality of education she provided. Zane started coming to town every 2 weeks instead of once a month. He would arrive on Saturday afternoon, conduct his business at the general store and other establishments, and then find his way to wherever Violet was. Sometimes they had dinner together at the boarding house. Sometimes they took walks along the Pecos River, talking about everything and nothing. Once, he brought her a beautiful piece of polished agate he had found in the mountains, its layers of color like a sunset frozen in stone. Violet found herself looking forward to his visits with an anticipation that made it hard to focus on her work. She would watch the trail from the mountains on Saturday mornings, her heart leaping when she spotted his familiar figure on the gray horse. The townspeople noticed, of course. In a place as small as Roswell, nothing stayed secret for long. Mrs. Cooper teased Violet gently about her mountain man suitor. Some of the female students giggled and whispered when they saw Zane waiting for her after school. Most people seemed to approve of the match, though a few like Patterson made disapproving comments about what kind of woman would want to associate with a rough character like Sullivan. Violet did not care. For the first time since coming to Roswell, she felt truly happy. It was late November, nearly 3 months since the school board meeting, when things took an unexpected turn. Violet was teaching a mathematics lesson on a cold Wednesday afternoon when Tommy Patterson raised his hand. She called on him, expecting a question about the fractions they were working on. Instead, the boy said, "Miss Vance, my pa says you and Mr. Sullivan are courting." "Is that true?" The other students immediately perked up with interest. Violet felt her cheeks flush but kept her voice level. "That is a personal matter, Tommy, not appropriate for school discussion. Now, can anyone tell me how to reduce this fraction?" But the damage was done. The children were distracted and whispering for the rest of the day, and Violet knew the question had not been Tommy's idea. Patterson was clearly trying to stir up trouble again. Sure enough, by Friday evening, Violet was summoned to another meeting with the school board. This time, the issue was not her teaching methods but her relationship with Zane. "We have had concerns raised about propriety," Reverend Thomas said uncomfortably. He was a kind man at heart and clearly did not enjoy this conversation. "Some parents feel it is inappropriate for the schoolteacher to be keeping company with a man she is not engaged to, particularly a man of Mr. Sullivan's reputation." "What reputation would that be?" Violet asked, trying to keep the anger out of her voice. "Zane is a good, honest man who has never caused trouble in this town. He is a rough mountain man with no ties to the community," Mr. Cordova said. "Some people question whether he is a suitable match for someone in a position of moral authority like a teacher." Violet wanted to scream. She wanted to point out the hypocrisy of them questioning her morality when she had done nothing wrong, but she forced herself to stay calm. "Mr. Sullivan and I are friends," she said carefully. "We share common interests and enjoy each other's company. We have never been alone in inappropriate circumstances. Mrs. Cooper is always present when he visits me at the boarding house, and our walks are in full public view. There is nothing improper about our relationship." "Perhaps not," Mrs. Henderson said gently. "But you must understand, Violet, as the schoolteacher, you are held to higher standards than most. The appearance of impropriety can be as damaging as actual impropriety." "What are you asking me to do?" Violet asked, though she feared she already knew. The board members exchanged glances. Finally, Dr. Morrison spoke. "We think it would be best if you and Mr. Sullivan either formalized your relationship with an engagement or stopped seeing each other, at least until the end of the school year." It felt like a punch to the stomach. Violet had been falling in love with Zane, she could admit that to herself now, but they had known each other for less than 3 months. Marriage was a huge step, not something to be rushed into just to satisfy town gossip. But the alternative, not seeing him for months, felt unbearable. "I need time to think about this," she said quietly. "Of course," Reverend Thomas agreed. "We are not demanding an immediate answer. Take a week to consider your options. We will meet again next Friday." Violet left the meeting feeling numb. She walked back to the boarding house in a daze, barely noticing the cold wind that had picked up, carrying the scent of possible snow. The next day was Saturday, one of Zane's visiting days. Violet had been looking forward to it all week, but now she dreaded having to tell him about the board's ultimatum. He arrived in the early afternoon, and Violet could tell immediately that something was wrong. His smile when he saw her was genuine, but there was tension in his shoulders. "Can we take a walk?" he asked. "I need to talk to you about something." They walked along the river, the water running low and clear in the winter dry season. For a while neither of them spoke, and Violet wondered if Zane had heard about the board's concerns. Finally he stopped and turned to face her. "I heard about the meeting yesterday." "How?" Violet asked, though she was not really surprised. News traveled fast in Roswell. "Dr. Morrison stopped by the general store this morning. He thought I should know what was happening before I came to see you." Zane's jaw was tight with suppressed anger. "They have no right to dictate your personal life like that." "They think they do," Violet said wearily. "As the school teacher, I am supposed to be a moral example for the community. Apparently, being courted by an unmarried man damages that example." "That is ridiculous," Zane growled. "We have done nothing wrong." "I know." Violet wrapped her shawl tighter around herself, suddenly cold despite the afternoon sun. "But perception matters to them more than truth." Zane was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the river. When he spoke again, his voice was low and intense. "There is a solution to this. We could get married." Violet's heart seemed to stop. "Zane." "I know it is fast," he continued, the words coming out in a rush now. "I know we have only been courting for a couple of months. But Violet, I care about you. More than I have ever cared about anyone. When I am up in the mountains, you are all I think about. I count the days until I can see you again. And I cannot stand the thought of not being able to spend time with you for months, just because some narrow-minded people cannot mind their own business." Violet felt tears prickling at her eyes, but they were not sad tears. "I care about you too, so much. But marriage is forever, Zane. It is not something to rush into just to solve a problem. Is it rushing if I already know you are the woman I want to spend my life with?" Zane asked. He reached out and gently cupped her face in his large hands, looking down at her with such tenderness it made her breath catch. "I have been alone for a long time, Violet. By choice, because I never found anyone who made me want to change that. But you make me want things I thought I had given up on. A home, a family, someone to share my life with. I know I am not much of a catch. I live in a cabin in the mountains. I have no formal education or fancy manners, but I can provide for you, and I would protect you, and I would love you for the rest of my days if you would let me." A tear escaped and rolled down Violet's cheek. Zane gently wiped it away with his thumb. "You are everything I could want," Violet said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You are strong and kind and thoughtful. You stood up for me when no one else would. You see me as I truly am, not as what people think I should be. But Zane, if we get married, everything will change. I love teaching, and I do not know if I could keep my job once I am a wife. Most schools do not employ married women." "I know," Zane said. "And I would never ask you to give up something you love. We can figure it out together. Maybe you could keep teaching, at least until we have children. Or maybe you could tutor students privately. Or maybe there is some other solution we have not thought of yet. All I know is that I want to face those problems with you, not without you." Violet searched his face, looking for any doubt or uncertainty, but all she saw was honest emotion and determination. This man, this strong, protective, thoughtful man, loved her, and she loved him. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Zane's face broke into a smile of pure joy, and then he was kissing her, his lips gentle despite his size and strength. Violet melted into him, her hands coming up to rest against his broad chest, feeling the solid warmth of him. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard and smiling like fools. "We should tell the board right away," Zane said, "so they cannot cause you any more trouble." They walked back to town hand in hand, and Violet felt like she was floating. Everything had happened so fast, but it felt right in a way she could not explain. She had come to Roswell looking to make a difference through teaching. She had not expected to find love as well, but here it was, powerful and real and wonderful. Reverend Thomas was surprised but pleased when they knocked on his door and announced their engagement. Word spread through Roswell like wildfire, and by Sunday morning, everyone knew that the schoolteacher and the mountain man were getting married. The reaction was mixed. Some people, like Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Morrison, were genuinely happy for them. Others, like Patterson, seemed annoyed that their attempt to cause trouble had backfired. But engaged couples were socially acceptable in ways that courting couples were not, so the gossip died down quickly. They decided to get married in December, giving them a few weeks to prepare but not drawing things out unnecessarily. Violet had no family in New Mexico to invite, and Zane had no one at all, so it would be a small ceremony. Just them, the Reverend, and a few witnesses. In the meantime, Zane had to prepare his cabin for a wife. It had been built for one person living alone, rough and functional but not really suitable for Violet. He spent his days adding on a proper bedroom, installing a better stove, building furniture, and making 100 other improvements. Violet visited once before the wedding, riding up to the mountains with Zane on a clear Saturday. The journey took several hours, following narrow trails through pine forests and rocky canyons. Violet was not an experienced rider, and she clung to Zane nervously at first, but gradually she relaxed and began to enjoy the stunning scenery. The cabin was situated in a small valley surrounded by towering peaks. A stream ran nearby, and the forest came right up to the clearing where Zane had built his home. The cabin itself was larger than Violet had expected, a solid log structure with a stone chimney and real glass windows that must have cost a fortune to haul up from town. Inside, it was sparse but clean. Zane had clearly worked hard to make it nice for her. There were curtains on the windows, rugs on the floor, and a beautiful quilt on the bed in the new bedroom. Books lined shelves on one wall, his collection accumulated over years of trading. "It is wonderful," Violet said honestly, looking around with delight. "I can be happy here." "You are sure?" Zane asked, looking uncertain. "It is pretty isolated. The nearest neighbor is 5 miles away. You will not have the social life you had in town." Violet turned to face him, taking his large hands in her smaller ones. "Zane, I did not have much of a social life in town. Most people barely tolerated me. I would much rather be here with you, surrounded by all this beauty, than in Roswell being constantly judged and criticized." "What about your teaching?" Zane asked seriously. "I meant what I said about not wanting you to give it up." Violet had been thinking about this a lot. "I will talk to the board. Maybe I can continue teaching for the rest of this school year at least. After that, we will see. If they will not keep me on as a married woman, perhaps I can tutor children privately, like you suggested. Or perhaps I can teach my own children someday." The thought of children, of a real family with Zane, made her smile. They were married on December 15th, 1876, in the small church in Roswell. Violet wore a simple blue dress, her best one, with her hair pinned up and adorned with a few late-blooming wildflowers Zane had somehow found despite the winter cold. Zane wore new clothes purchased from the general store, dark trousers and a white shirt that strained across his muscular shoulders. He had trimmed his beard and tied his long hair back neatly. Mrs. Henderson and Dr. Morrison stood as witnesses. A few other townspeople attended, more out of curiosity than friendship, but Violet did not care. The only person who mattered was standing in front of her, holding her hands gently in his, promising to love and cherish her for the rest of his life. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, Zane kissed her with such tender passion that several of the watching women sighed romantically. They had a small celebration dinner at the boarding house, Mrs. Cooper's gift to them, and then they rode out to the cabin as the sun was setting. Violet wore a heavy coat over her dress, and Zane wrapped blankets around her to keep her warm during the journey. Their wedding night was gentle and sweet. Zane was so careful with her, mindful of his size and strength, treating her like something precious and fragile. Violet was nervous at first, but his patience and obvious love made everything feel natural and right. Afterward, lying in their bed with Zane's strong arms around her, Violet felt completely content. This was not the life she had imagined when she left Boston. She had not expected to marry a mountain man and live in an isolated cabin, but it was perfect in ways she could not have anticipated. "I love you," she whispered into the darkness. "I love you too," Zane rumbled, his deep voice vibrating through his chest where her head rested. "More than I knew it was possible to love someone." The next morning, Violet woke to find Zane already up, building up the fire in the stove to warm the cabin. Snow had fallen during the night, coating everything in pristine white. "It is beautiful," Violet said, looking out the window at the transformed landscape. "Welcome to winter in the mountains," Zane said with a smile. "It will snow like this on and off until March or April. Are you sure you are ready for it?" "As long as I have you, I am ready for anything," Violet replied. They settled into married life with surprising ease. Violet continued teaching in Roswell during the week, staying at the boarding house from Monday through Friday and riding up to the cabin on weekends. It was not ideal, being apart so much, but they made it work. Zane came to town more often, helping with odd jobs around Roswell to earn extra money and to be closer to his wife. The school board had agreed to let Violet finish out the school year, despite being married, though they made it clear they would need to find a new teacher for the following year. Violet accepted this with grace, knowing she had pushed the boundaries of what the town would accept as far as they would go. Winter deepened, and the rides between town and cabin became more difficult. By January, the trails were often impassable due to snow, and Violet sometimes went 2 weeks without seeing Zane. Those separations were hard, but they made their reunions all the sweeter. In February, Violet realized she was pregnant. The symptoms were subtle at first, just unusual fatigue and a slight queasiness in the mornings, but as someone who prided herself on observation, she recognized the signs. She told Zane on a snowy Saturday evening, the two of them sitting by the fire after dinner. He was silent for a long moment after she spoke, and Violet felt a flutter of worry. They had not planned this quite so soon. Then Zane pulled her into his arms, holding her so tight she could barely breathe, and she felt wetness on her hair where his face pressed against the top of her head. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Violet asked, needing to hear him say it. "Happy does not begin to cover it," Zane said, pulling back to look at her with shining eyes. "Violet, you have given me everything. A home, a purpose, love. And now a child. I cannot even express what that means to me." Violet felt tears of joy running down her own cheeks. "I am scared," she admitted. "I do not know anything about being a mother." "You will be wonderful," Zane assured her. "You are patient and kind and smart. You teach children every day. Our baby will be so lucky to have you." The pregnancy changed their plans. Violet could not keep teaching and living in town while carrying a child. The stress and travel would be too much. She resigned her position at the end of March, after the school board had found her replacement. A middle-aged man from Santa Fe with impeccable credentials and no controversial teaching methods. Violet was surprised by how much she would miss it. She had a little party on her last day, and several of her students cried when they said goodbye. Even some of the parents who had complained about her seemed sorry to see her go, having grown to appreciate the education their children received. "You made a difference here, Mrs. Henderson told her, pressing a beautiful embroidered baby blanket into her hands. "Do not ever doubt that." Violet moved to the cabin full-time in April, just as spring was beginning to touch the mountains. The snow melted slowly, revealing wildflowers and green grass. Zane was attentive and protective, constantly worried that she was doing too much or tiring herself out. "I am pregnant, not made of glass," Violet reminded him frequently, laughing at his hovering, but secretly she loved how much he cared. He made sure she had everything she needed, built her a comfortable chair for sitting in the sun, brought her books from town to keep her mind engaged. He talked to her belly every night, telling their unborn child about the mountains and the animals, and how much he was looking forward to meeting them. As summer arrived and Violet's belly swelled with their growing child, she and Zane fell into a peaceful rhythm. They worked together maintaining the cabin and the small garden Zane had planted. They took walks in the forest when the weather was nice. They read together in the evenings, Violet often reading aloud while Zane worked on projects with his hands. Sometimes Violet thought about her old life in Boston, about her family and the sophisticated world she had left behind. But she did not regret her choices. This life, simple and sometimes hard, was filled with more love and contentment than she had ever known. Dr. Morrison visited once a month to check on her pregnancy, making the long journey up the mountain with good-natured complaints about being too old for such travel. He assured them that everything looked healthy and normal, and that Violet should deliver sometime in early October. As the due date approached, Zane became more anxious. He insisted they move into town for the last month so that Violet would be close to the doctor. They took a room at the boarding house, and Mrs. Cooper fussed over Violet like a mother hen. Their son was born on October 3rd, 1877, after a long labor that had Zane pacing the hallway outside their room like a caged animal. When Dr. Morrison finally let him in to meet his child, Zane approached the bed with visible awe. "A boy," Violet said tiredly, cradling the tiny bundle. "We have a son." Zane carefully took the baby, his huge hands incredibly gentle. The infant looked impossibly small against his father's broad chest. Tears rolled down Zane's bearded cheeks as he stared down at his son. "He is perfect," Zane whispered. "You are perfect. Thank you." They named him Zachary, and he had his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair. Zane was a devoted father from the very first day, helping with everything from diaper changes to midnight feedings. Violet had worried that having a baby in the isolated cabin might be difficult, but somehow they managed. The first winter with a newborn was challenging. There were sleepless nights and moments of exhaustion and worry, but there were also countless moments of joy. Watching Zane sing to Zachary in his deep, rumbling voice, seeing their son's first smile, the way Zachary would grab onto his father's finger with his tiny hand and hold tight. As Zachary grew from an infant into a toddler, he showed signs of having both his parents' best qualities. He was curious and bright like Violet, always exploring and asking questions. But he also had Zane's quiet strength and his comfort in nature. By the time he was 2, he could identify different bird calls and animal tracks. Violet never went back to formal teaching, but she found other ways to use her skills. She tutored children from nearby ranches and homesteads, families who were too far from Roswell to attend the town school. Word spread about her abilities, and she sometimes had 3 or 4 students riding up to the cabin for lessons once or twice a week. Zane continued his trapping and hunting, but he also started guiding wealthy Easterners who wanted to experience the mountains. It turned out that his knowledge of the wilderness and his protective nature made him an excellent guide. The money was good, allowing them to make improvements to the cabin and save for the future. When Zachary was 3, Violet became pregnant again. This time, the news was expected and welcome. They had always planned on having more than one child, and Zachary was eager for a sibling even though he did not fully understand what that meant. Their second child, a daughter they named Vivian, was born in May of 1880. She had Zane's dark hair and Violet's green eyes, and from the very beginning, she had a fierce personality that made both parents laugh. Life continued in a pattern of work and joy, challenges and triumphs. Zachary started learning to read almost before he could walk, sitting on his mother's lap while she pointed out letters and words. Vivian was more interested in following her father around, learning about plants and animals. In 1883, when Zachary was 6 and Vivian was 3, Roswell got a new schoolteacher, a young woman named Miss Sarah who was struggling with the same resistance to change that Violet had faced. Violet heard about it through her tutoring students and felt a pang of sympathy. "I should go talk to her," Violet told Zane one evening. "Let her know she is not alone." She rode into Roswell the next week and introduced herself to Miss Sarah. The young teacher was so relieved to meet someone who understood what she was going through that she nearly cried. Violet shared her experiences and offered advice, and they quickly became friends. Through Miss Sarah, Violet became more connected to Roswell again. She started attending church more regularly, bringing the children to socialize with other families. Some of the people who had been her harshest critics 7 years earlier were now grandparents who praised her for how well-behaved and intelligent her children were. Even Patterson, now considerably older and mellower, stopped her after church one Sunday. "Mrs. Sullivan," he said formally, "I wanted to tell you that my grandson Tommy, he is in college now back east, studying to be an engineer. His professors say he is one of their brightest students." Violet remembered Tommy, the boy whose father had burst into her classroom all those years ago. "That is wonderful," she said sincerely. "You must be very proud." Patterson looked uncomfortable. "He says it is because of you, says you taught him to love learning, to think beyond what he could see right in front of him." "I was too stubborn to see it then, but I want you to know I was wrong about you. You were a good teacher, the best this town ever had." It was as close to an apology as Patterson would ever manage, and Violet accepted it with grace. "Thank you for telling me that. It means more than you know." As the years passed, Violet and Zane's life together deepened and matured. They had their disagreements, of course. No marriage was perfect. But they had learned how to talk through problems, how to support each other, how to keep their love alive even through difficult times. Zachary grew into a tall, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as the outdoors. Vivian was wild and free, always climbing trees and catching frogs. In 1886, Violet gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl they named Victor and Vanessa. The cabin, which had seemed so spacious when it was just her and Zane, was now bursting with noise and activity and life. Zane built additions onto the cabin, creating separate rooms for the children. He built furniture, shelves for Violet's growing library of books, a bigger table for family meals. The cabin became a real home, filled with laughter and love. Violet taught all the children herself, using the skills she had honed in the Roswell schoolhouse. They learned reading, writing, arithmetic, science, history, and literature. But they also learned the practical skills their father taught: how to track animals, how to survive in the wilderness, how to respect nature. On their 10th wedding anniversary in December of 1886, Zane took Violet back to the spot by the Pecos River where he had proposed. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked, holding her hand as they looked out at the water. "Giving up your career, your dreams of making a difference through teaching?" Violet thought about the question seriously before answering. "I did not give up teaching. I just found a different way to do it." "And as for making a difference, look at our children, Zane. Look at Zachary's brilliance, Vivian's strength, the twins' curiosity. I am making a difference every single day. Plus the students I tutor, the families I help. Maybe I am not changing as many lives as I would have in a schoolhouse, but the impact I am having is deeper." She turned to face him fully, reaching up to touch his bearded cheek. He still wore his hair long, though it was now streaked with silver. His body was still powerful and strong, though he moved with the slight stiffness of approaching middle age. "And I have you," Violet continued. "A partner who respects my mind as much as he loves me. A man who stood up for me when no one else would, who believed in me when I doubted myself. You gave me a life full of love and purpose and adventure. How could I ever regret that?" Zane pulled her into his arms, holding her close. "I am the lucky one. You took a rough mountain man and taught him how to be part of a family again. You gave me children I adore and a home I love to return to. You made me whole." They stood there together as the sun set over the New Mexico landscape, two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful together. By 1890, Roswell had grown considerably. The town now had multiple stores, a proper school building, a railroad connection, and a population in the hundreds. Zachary, now 13, sometimes talked about going away to college like Tommy Patterson had. Violet encouraged him, knowing that the world was changing and her children would need to be prepared for it. Vivian, at 10, declared she wanted to be a doctor like Sarah McKinnon had dreamed of all those years ago. Violet told her daughter that women were indeed becoming doctors now, that the world was slowly opening up to possibilities that had not existed when Violet was young. The twins, now 4, were still too young to have firm ambitions, but they were bright and curious and full of potential. Violet sometimes went into Roswell and visited the new school building. She would stand outside and listen to the sound of children's voices reciting lessons, and she would feel a bittersweet nostalgia for her teaching days. But then she would ride back to the cabin in the mountains, where her own children waited with Zane, and she would feel nothing but gratitude for the life she had chosen. In the spring of 1891, news came that changed everything. The territorial government was offering land grants to families willing to establish schools in remote areas. Violet heard about it through Dr. Morrison, who thought immediately of her. "You could have your own school again," he told her excitedly during one of his visits. "Right here in the mountains. There are enough homesteading families in this area now that a school would serve at least a dozen children, maybe more." Violet brought the idea to Zane that evening after the children were in bed. She explained the land grant program, how they could build a proper schoolhouse on their property, how she could teach not just her own children but all the children of the mountain families. Zane listened carefully, then smiled. "You want to do this?" "I do," Violet admitted. "But it would mean more work, more people coming to our home, less privacy. I would not do it if you were not comfortable with it." Zane reached across the table and took her hand. "Violet, you have spent 15 years supporting my life in these mountains, raising our children, making this cabin into a home. If you want to teach again, to share your gifts with more children, then we will make it happen. I will build you the finest schoolhouse in New Mexico territory." And he did. Over the summer of 1891, with help from neighboring homesteaders whose children would attend the school, Zane built a beautiful one-room schoolhouse near their cabin. It had large windows for light, a good stove for heat, and enough space for desks for 20 students. The Mountain Valley School, as it came to be called, opened in September of 1891. Violet stood at the door on that first day, now 37 years old, greeting students just as she had 15 years earlier in Roswell. But this time was different. These families had specifically chosen her to teach their children. They trusted her methods, valued her education, and supported her completely. Zachary, Vivian, and the twins were her students, along with children from a dozen other families scattered through the mountains. Violet taught with all the passion and innovation she had brought to Roswell, but now without the constant criticism and resistance. The school was a success from the very beginning. Children thrived under Violet's instruction, and word spread. More families moved to the area specifically because of the school, and within 2 years, Violet had to ask Zane to build an addition to accommodate all the students. Zane watched his wife bloom in her new role, saw the joy teaching brought her, and felt proud that he could give her this gift. He continued his work as a guide and hunter, but he also became involved in the school, teaching the children about wilderness skills and natural science. Their children grew and flourished. Zachary went off to university in 1893, studying engineering as he had always dreamed. He came home for visits full of stories about the wider world, and Violet and Zane listened with pride. Vivian, determined as ever, began studying with Dr. Morrison when she was 14, learning everything she could about medicine. She eventually went to medical school, one of the few women in her class, and returned to New Mexico to practice medicine in Roswell. The twins followed their own paths, Victor becoming a teacher like his mother, and Vanessa marrying a rancher and raising a family while also serving as a midwife to mountain communities. Through all of this, Violet and Zane's love remained strong. They had built not just a life, but a legacy together. The Mountain Valley School became known throughout the territory for its excellent education. Students who learned there went on to colleges and careers across the country, carrying with them the values of curiosity, critical thinking, and respect that Violet had instilled. In 1900, at the turn of the new century, Violet and Zane celebrated their 24th wedding anniversary. They had both turned gray, Zane's long hair now more silver than dark, Violet's auburn hair shot through with white. But they still walked hand in hand through the mountains they loved, still talked late into the night about ideas and dreams, still kissed each other good morning and good night. They had 9 grandchildren by then, and the cabin had been expanded so many times it was practically a small compound. Family gatherings were noisy, chaotic, wonderful affairs with children running everywhere and multiple generations sharing meals. One evening, sitting on the porch of their cabin watching the sun set behind the peaks, Violet reflected on her journey. "You remember the day we met?" she asked Zane. "Well, not met exactly, but the day you first defended me at the schoolhouse." "Of course," Zane said, his arm around her shoulders. "You looked so small and fierce trying to stand up to George Patterson. I knew right then I was going to help you." "Did you know you would fall in love with me?" Violet teased. Zane chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "Maybe not right then, but pretty soon after. You were impossible not to love. We have had a good life, have we not?" Violet said, leaning into his warmth. "The best life," Zane agreed. "Better than I ever imagined possible when I was living alone in these mountains. You took a solitary man and showed him what it means to belong somewhere, to someone. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to wake up excited every morning." "You gave me those things too," Violet said softly. "You believed in me when almost everyone else doubted. You protected me, supported me, loved me unconditionally. You helped me become the person I was meant to be." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. The same stars that had wheeled overhead on their wedding night 24 years earlier. Violet thought about that frightened young schoolteacher who had stood alone on the steps of the Roswell schoolhouse, wondering if she should just give up and go home to Boston. She thought about the mountain man who had watched from the shadows and decided to intervene. She thought about all the moments between then and now, the challenges and triumphs, the sorrows and joys that had woven their lives together into something beautiful. "Thank you," she whispered to Zane. "For what?" he asked. "For defending me that day in front of the whole town. For seeing me when no one else did. For loving me exactly as I am." Zane kissed the top of her head, holding her close. "Thank you for letting me, for taking a chance on a rough mountain man, for building this life with me." As they sat there together in the gathering darkness, surrounded by the mountains and the stars and the life they had created, Violet knew with absolute certainty that every difficult moment, every challenge overcome, every risk taken, had been worth it. She had come to the Wild West looking to make a difference as a teacher. She had found that, but she had also found so much more. She had found a partner who respected her strength, a love that transcended social expectations, a family that brought her joy beyond measure, and a home in the most unlikely of places. The schoolteacher and the mountain man, two people who should never have found each other, had instead found everything they needed. And in doing so, they had created a legacy that would ripple through generations, touching countless lives with the power of education, the strength of conviction, and most importantly, the transformative force of true love. Their story was one of courage in the face of prejudice, of standing firm in one's beliefs while remaining open to unexpected possibilities, of building bridges across differences, and of finding family where you least expect it. It was a story that would be told and retold in the mountain communities of New Mexico for decades to come, inspiring others to be brave, to be true to themselves, and to never underestimate the power of one person defending another in front of a whole town. As the years continued to pass, Violet kept teaching until she was 70 years old, educating 3 generations of mountain children. Zane remained her partner and supporter until the very end, never wavering in his belief in her abilities. When Violet finally retired in 1915, the territorial government honored her with a special commendation for her 50 years of service to education in New Mexico. They lived out their final years in the cabin they had built together, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and eventually great-grandchildren. Zane passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1920, at the age of 72, with Violet holding his hand. She followed him 2 years later, at the age of 68, having lived a life fuller and richer than she ever could have imagined when she first stepped off the train in Roswell all those years ago. The Mountain Valley School continued to operate for another 30 years, a testament to their vision and dedication. And in the mountains of New Mexico, their descendants still tell the story of the schoolteacher no parent respected, and the mountain man who defended her in front of the whole town. 2 people who found each other against all odds and built a love that lasted a lifetime. Their graves sit side by side on a hill overlooking the valley where they lived, the mountains they loved rising all around them. The inscription on their shared headstone reads simply, "Violet and Zane Sullivan. They taught us to be brave, to be kind, and to love without limits." And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all.